So I think that we need more nurses to sit in the chief executive officer role. I think we need more nurses not only as chief nursing officers, where they've always been there, but I think not been respected at the same level of other people that sit at the table, really to speak their voice.
Welcome to Nursing Beyond the Bedside. I'm Audrey, your host, and a nurse who pivoted my path several years ago. After 8 years as a critical care nurse, I was ready for change. I craved higher pay and more flexibility, but was struggling to find a clear path forward. Fast forward through positions in recruiting, customer success, and marketing, and many lessons learned along the way. Today, I run Pivot Path, a company dedicated to empowering nurses to redefine their careers. This podcast is designed to help you navigate the journey from clinical bedside nursing to a fulfilling career that aligns with your passions and goals. Here, you'll discover inspiring stories from nurses who've gone beyond the bedside, successfully transitioning to non-clinical roles, or redefining their nursing career. Join us as we hear their stories and share actionable strategies to help you make your own leap. Whether you're a new listener curious about what lies beyond the bedside, or a returning audience member in need of some fresh motivation, this podcast is your go-to resource for exploring new opportunities that can transform your career. Let's get started. Today, we're joined by Kim Keene, a seasoned healthcare executive with over 3 decades of leadership experience in nursing and hospital administration. Recently retired as a CEO, Kim has successfully led hospitals across multiple states, navigating both for-profit and not-for-profit systems. With her background in nursing and a master's in business administration, Kim offers a unique blend of clinical and business expertise. Now, she provides litigation support and healthcare advisory services as a consultant. In this episode, we'll explore her journey from nurse to CEO, the role of nursing in leadership, and the importance of patient-centered care. Welcome to the show, Kim.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me.
I'm really excited to share your perspective here today. I actually have not had anyone in healthcare administration on the show yet, so it'll be great to hear the perspective that you bring.
I'm happy to be your first, and hopefully not your last, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Hopefully just the beginning.
Absolutely.
So I know we want to talk a lot about kind of like your view on nursing and the value of nurses and leadership. And I think what would be helpful is for you to just kind of dive in and give us a little bit of an overview of your background so that we can understand the perspective that you're bringing to the table.
Okay. Well, I started out as a diploma graduate and then ended up getting my bachelor's in nursing and finally my master's in business administration. But my goal really when I went into nursing was really just to help someone. I grew up in a multi-generational family with my grandparents. My mom was a diabetic since she was 10 years old. So I was always surrounded by people that needed some form of health care, more importantly, probably nursing care. And so nursing seemed like a great opportunity for me and a career for me. So my plan was always to be a critical care nurse. I got out of nursing school. My first job was in telemetry. I stayed there about a year and went into the intensive care unit. It was a medical ICU, but ended up being a mixture of an ICU as it expanded. Loved it, very quickly got appointed into leadership. And then as hospitals changed, my role kept expanding. I picked up the PACU. I picked up the IV team. I picked up GI lab. And then I was approached by the CEO of the hospital to assume the emergency services, which included pre-hospital and the emergency services department, also the GI lab. Don't know why, I guess because they were next to each other. But I was reluctant to do that. As anyone who's a nurse listening to this, they kind of know that the critical care nurses and the emergency room nurses are not what we consider best friends in hospitals. Not really sure why it is that way, but it is that way. I see it as an administrator. I saw it as a bedside nurse. So I had some reluctance to go to the emergency department and was really encouraged by the administration to give it a shot. I had done 13 years in critical care as a leader. They felt it was a good opportunity for me to expand. And at that time, I had really no desire to expand my role into what. I just said, well, okay, you've convinced me. Now I have to convince myself that I'm educated and I can do a good job. And so I went and obtained my CEN because I had CCRN certification and became the director of emergency services, which then opened up a whole bunch of opportunities because I started dealing with ambulance services, contract services with emergency physicians, and really kind of laid the groundwork on becoming like an operations, understanding the business operations of healthcare. And from there, that's how it started, really.
What was that very first leadership role that you took?
It was, at that time, the terminology was head nurse. So it was the assistant head nurse of the intensive care unit. And then I became the head nurse, and then I think director of critical care, and then director of emergency services.
And earlier, before taking that position, did you see yourself pursuing leadership positions, or did that just kind of come to you?
It just came to me. I think it came to me because you're asked to take charge, and then you do a pretty good job, and everyone likes working when you're the charge nurse, and then they needed people to help with other things. And I always am a person that feels like I can make a difference, right? So I knew I could make a better schedule than was going out, or at least I thought I could, right? I knew I could make the staff happier. And so, I gave myself the opportunity to try, and I just happened to do a good job at it. And a lot of that is I surrounded myself with experts. I reached out. I never said I knew what I was doing all the time. And I just kept learning it on the job and refining it. And even taking, going back to school and getting my degrees, I think helped a lot. But I was even curious before I even did that. Like, I wanted to understand budgeting of the units. And so I went to a library because there wasn't Google back then. And I looked at budgeting and how to do it. And so I'm just always been a curious, lifelong learner. I still am.
Yeah, that growth mindset and curiosity is so important when pivoting into really anything new. What do you think? And I know that you mentioned when you were overseeing emergency service, you got a lot more exposure to the operational side of things. Throughout those leadership positions, what do you think was like the most challenging thing for you to learn that was like maybe totally new that you didn't have any background in yet?
I think understanding the payer system within a health system, and even this day, I would not say I'm an expert, but just understanding the nuances of all that and what it meant to really kind of help people understand, especially when you're communicating with doctors and you're saying, we have to use this 4x4, not this 4x4, and the reason for it. So I think that was something that I had to learn. I also think having to just understand operations by watching other people and looking at people that you admired and kind of asking them, well, how do you know how to talk to an employee in this situation, and how do you learn it? And you just have to really rely on your networking and knowing that you can find resources. Because we're just taught, nurses, I think in the beginning and in some instances even today, think of nursing as I go in, I clock in, and I leave. And so what I do in my 12 hours, 8 to 12 hours, that's nursing, and I walk away from it. And as we have realized, it's hard to walk away from taking care of patients all the time. There's a lot that plays on your mind. And two, you second guess yourself a lot of times. So getting the confidence to understand that I am doing the right thing, and also the collaboration. I was fortunate that some of the early physician leaders that I worked with were all about collaboration and that we were a part of the team. I just wasn't a person that did things that they ordered. We were a collaborative team.
Yeah. I love that. And also, you mentioned that with these roles, you took them on thinking like, well, I can make a difference. Like, I can do this better. And so I love that attitude. And that plays a lot into this like philosophy that you have about the importance of having nursing and healthcare leadership. So let's dive in there a little bit. And I'd love to hear kind of about your perspective about bringing the nurse voice into decision making and how that nursing hands-on experience can add to those discussions in the healthcare environment.
So I think it's critical that nursing is at the table, right? And when I first started my role, there were very few nurses that were in a leadership position they were maybe the directors of their units, but they really didn't have a voice in decision making. It was all pushed down to them. And so I would be sitting at a senior table or the executive table, and they would say, "Oh, Kim's the heartbeat of the administration because she's the nurse." Well, yeah, I am the heartbeat, but I also understand that the nurses are at the bedside of the heartbeat, not me sitting in a table. So I never forgot that. I think that one thing that COVID really taught, the community always knew how important nursing was. I mean, I think the community, and I talk about this analogy a lot. If you are in the house, if your next door neighbor has a doctor on one side and has a nurse on the other side of their house and they get sick, who do they call first? They call the nurse. I mean, they just do. So there is kind of I think, a community respect, as we've seen in a lot of the studies, that nursing is well respected. But when COVID came, we realized at that point that people really needed nursing care. And also, as the population's aging, and most of us either have elderly parents or elderly grandparents or elderly friends that we're taking care of, they need nursing care. So I think it really put nursing up into a different kind of perspective throughout the country, because I've said this before and I feel very firmly and strongly about it, is if you want to go have surgery, you can have it done in a surgical hospital. If you want to have an x-ray, you can go to an imaging center and have an x-ray. If you want to have lab, you can go to lab service. But if you get admitted to the hospital, you really get admitted for one reason and one reason only, and that's to have nursing care. So that's how important you are at the most critical, vulnerable time in your life. When you get admitted to the hospital, you're relying on that nurse to provide you the care that you need to get well. And we do it as a team. Obviously, there's physicians that direct the diagnostic area of the hospital, of the patient. But it's so important that we realize how important the nurse is. In a large healthcare system that I was associated with, one of the most senior executives came out and said to nursing, "I'm sorry that I treated you as a cost center." Well, I understand that maybe now that person realizes that he treated nursing as a cost center, but how could you be in administration and not realize that is one of your most valuable resources? It is the person that's taking care of your patient front end. So I think that we need more nurses to sit in the chief executive officer role. I think we need more nurses not only as chief nursing officers, where they've always been there, but I think not been respected at the same level of other people that sit at the table, really to speak their voice. It is important that chief executive, I think that, the success that we saw during the pandemic, at least in my little hospital that I was responsible for, I think had a lot to do that I was a nurse sitting at the realm, and that I could say, this is acceptable, this isn't acceptable, this is what we need to do. I think it made a difference.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that is a really powerful perspective that you bring on being admitted to the hospital and being there for the nursing care.
Mm.
I think that as nurses, we get busy and almost even take our own value and like what we're doing for granted because, we clock in, we get through all of the tasks that we need to get through for our patients, and we clock out and we go home and we come back and do it 12 hours later.
Mhm.
And I think that value of nurses is something that, there's obviously an outside perspective to that and how others view our profession. But I think it's also how nurses view ourselves and our own value, and recognizing how powerful the perspective that we have to bring truly is.
I agree.
And so I kind of want to get back to how you went from, overseeing emergency services to getting into your CEO position. What did that journey look like?
So the CEO that asked me to take over emergency services happened to assume a new role, and he in a hospital in another state. And when he got there, the hospital was losing like $1 million a month. And so he was trying real quickly to figure out what was going on. And they had at the time what they called product lines many years ago. And one of them was cardiopulmonary. And he remembered me as a very strong leader with a strong background in critical care. And he called me up and said, would you be interested in being the vice president of cardiopulmonary in another state? And it just happened that timing was right for my family, that we could relocate to another state. I was intrigued by what that meant because I was now going to be experiencing true outpatient and clinic doctor clinics too, provider clinics too. And so I said yes. And I think partly is, you'll hear throughout my discussion, is I said yes a lot. You asked me to do it, I said yes. So I went there, I came down and I did that. We did a great job. We turned it around very quickly. The hospital did very well financially. The retention rate was good. The nurses were happy. We did really great things. I opened the first chest pain emergency department in the city and really did some great stuff and was very proud of what happened in that time frame. And as I continued to work in the hospital, then product lines kind of faded away and they weren't there anymore. They're coming back under a new name called service lines, but they're the same thing. And so it kind of faded away. And so the CEO just kept giving me more and more and more and more and more responsibility. And so I would have cardiopulmonary, and then I ended up getting radiology and imaging and laboratory and emergency services. And, I think at one point surgical services reported to me too, but at one point I had almost every department in the hospital at one point during my time there, my almost 14 years there, except philanthropy and materials management. So I just said yes a lot. I learned a lot.
Saying yes to opportunity is a common theme across nurses that I have on this show. So it stands true here too. And so I want to dive in to a little bit of the nitty gritty of what it means to be a CEO. Because for a lot of nurses who have only worked clinically, have only worked bedside, conceptually, we understand what a CEO is. But when we start to think about, well, what does that actually mean on a day-to-day basis? Describe your typical day. What kinds of things are you doing? What kinds of problems are you solving? Kind of break that down for us a little bit.
So I was fortunate enough in my CEO role to be in a smaller hospital. So it did make knowing people a little bit easier. So one of the things I did, because the hospital had been failing when we took it over, and I really was hired just to do like a 90-day assessment and ended up being made the full-time CEO, is I met with every single employee. And so that way, a lot of employees really didn't want to meet with the CEO. They're like, no, I get off at 7 a.m. and I want to go home. I go, okay, I'll be in at 6. I'll be in at midnight. I don't care. So I met with every single employee and I talked to every single employee and just said, tell me what you think about the hospital. Because I think a lot of times we don't ask, and then there's pockets of negativism that develop and urban legends and all this stuff. And I wanted them to know, look, I'm going to be here. You can ask me anything. I'll answer any question I can to the best of my ability. If I can't tell you the answer, I'll tell you. I'm not allowed to share that with you. So I think I developed some kind of honesty there. If I had 1,000 employees, I couldn't do it. I had like 350 employees. It took a lot of time, and there was some resistance, and there were some people who never showed up. And I'd make a couple appointments, and they would not, and that's fine. And I'll be all honest, when I looked at that, because I kind of kept that, they ended up leaving because they just didn't want to be in hospitals anymore, and that happens. So what you do as a CEO is you're really responsible to look at all the operations within the hospital, and you look for flaws in the system that may harm a patient so you can correct it. So I reviewed every admission that came in, every discharge that went out. I knew who was coming in, who was coming out, what the census was, what the surgical time was, how many people were in the emergency department. I looked at it all. And I was a bit of a micromanager, I'll admit that, because there was a hospital that was failing, and the hospital was so fragile at the time, I could not let a lot of things slip, because the hospital would have been taken over by the state and then probably closed. And the community would not have had a hospital in this community. So it was really critical to do that. But then build your team up. You meet with people, see who wants to be who's more interested. I met with every leader once we stabilized to say, what are you interested in? Some said, I'm happy doing what I'm doing. And then I tell the story. I was too, but then someone told me to do something else and I'm happier. So we have people that I've met with that ended up doing different jobs and doing great jobs. So one of our employees was a clinical employee, ended up picking up EDS, which is housekeeping, because they wanted to expand their knowledge. So you learn a little bit about everything, and then you do hire people that can do the job. But patient safety is your number one goal. You make sure that your patients and your employees are safe. That's what you do. That's what you worry about every day.
Well, it sounds like you were an incredible leader. I think that the taking on of speaking with everyone there is really special. Do you have, because I know that that is unique to being in like a smaller facility and being able to tackle that. Do you have any thoughts about how leaders can do something similar or achieve a similar outcome in a larger facility?
So I think you can achieve it with your bedside, or even your department leaders. Your department leaders should know every employee and should understand them. We want to treat everyone fairly. And sometimes that's not always equal because people have different things, right? So, you have to know the person to understand sometimes why Audrey didn't show up today, and that seems unusual. We have to know. She doesn't have to tell you her secrets or the reason, but you have to know her well enough that something seemed off. If you don't know the people that you're working for. So I think your leaders, your charge nurses can do it. Your lead supervisors can do it. Whatever the titles, it doesn't have to be nursing. But take an interest in the people that you're responsible for, because you're responsible for them. And I think you have to buy into that. And I think a lot of times they like, no, I'm the boss. I work Monday through Friday. No, you work 24/7. You're the boss. But you don't have to kill yourself doing that too.
I think that that's a great perspective because it really is the people that make up the place and how it operates. So being people first, I think, is awesome.
Well, and if you're kind, your employees normally are kind too.
Yeah, that's true. And I know that you are a strong advocate for diversity in healthcare leadership. Tell us a little bit about your work with the Women's Healthcare Executive Network and, women in leadership and just kind of your whole view on diversity and leadership roles.
Well, we need a louder voice for sure. So, women are not always at the table. And if you're not at the table, you're not going to really make too much impact. One of the things that I really believe is that you need a sponsor. Everyone can have a mentor to try to help them, right? But a sponsor is someone, when you're not at the table and they're talking about you or your department or a new department or whatever, someone's saying, hey, I think Audrey can do that. I think Kim can do that. And so finding someone that you trust that is sitting at the table that will sponsor you and help you go through your career, or even talk to you about what your career should be. So even though I'm retired now, I work for an organization called SCORE, which is a volunteer organization that mentors small businesses. And I also mentor some nursing leaders now, just because they called me up and asked me to. And it's nothing really as formal as SCORE. But I think that you really need to go out there and think about your profession as a career and a profession, not just a job. It's not a job. There's an art and a science to being in healthcare, and it is a true honor. And I think if you remember it, you forget some of the bad stuff that you don't like about healthcare. But if you remember that you're seeing this patient at their most vulnerable, and we also make them more vulnerable, right? We come in, and what's the first thing we say to them is, first, other than your name, take your clothes off. I think no other profession does that. So we make them vulnerable. We put a band on and we make them repeat things over and over and over again. And we don't even explain why we do that. They get so frustrated. That other person just asked me when my birthday was, or, well, let me see your band. Well, explain it, because we don't want to make a mistake. And you have to be careful, right?
Yeah, so true. And I love pulling out that, a sponsor can really change the game for you. Just having somebody championing for you is so valuable.
Right.
And how do you think, if you're a nurse at the bedside and you are looking at your nursing job as a career and you are trying to look ahead and look at the ways that you can advance, how might someone find a sponsor, start building a relationship with someone who could champion for them?
So if there's someone in your organization that you really think is kind of a leader you'd want to be, whether that person works in the dietary department or that person works in the administration office or wherever they work, I think that we get boxed into saying, I have to go have a nurse mentor, I have to go have the chief nursing officer. You go ask that director and say, look, I really like what you're doing. Can you just talk to me about your job? And people like to talk about themselves, right? And people also like to help. Most people like to help people. So I think that's part of it. I meet people all the time that I'm just amazed at the work they do. And I'm like, tell me how you do that. And that's how you do that. And then once you develop a relationship, then you ask them, what do you think my next steps are? They will help you and they'll start sponsoring you. But you have to ask and test.
Yeah, that's fantastic advice. And you're so right. I talk to nurses going through Pivot Path a lot about networking because it's not something that we really have to do as bedside nurses.
Right.
And I remember, I worked with a career coach who challenged me to set up like 10 informational interviews over the next month or something. And I was like, what do you mean? Like, I'm just supposed to like reach out to people and hope that they'll connect with me and like tell me about their career? And he was like, yeah, exactly. And I was like, people actually do that? And I was shocked with the response rate I got that was very positive of like, yeah, let's set up 20, 30 minutes, whatever, let's connect. And, networking is really just connecting and sharing stories kind of with your profession, your career, and each other's career in mind, and starting to build those relationships. So it makes sense that finding a sponsor to help you advance within the healthcare environment would be the same thing.
And I think there's opportunities for nurses that really aren't sure which way they want to go is if they have a small LLC that they developed or they like going to music festivals, they volunteer there or those are the ways you get to meet people outside your world, because we can be in the healthcare, we can be so cloistered. And I think you learn a lot from going outside your world a little bit.
Definitely. Especially if you're looking to pivot into something even adjacent to healthcare. Like the roles are different, the titles are different, the language is different. We do live in this kind of separate world in healthcare. So yeah, just having those conversations and being curious is key.
Right.
And so, we've talked a lot about like nurses elevating themselves professionally, thinking about their nursing as a profession and a career instead of a job. How can nurses who are at the bedside right now start to build confidence in what the value that they provide is?
So I really think it depends, in a critical care area, you could always work with your physician leaders and that kind of builds confidence. And sometimes precepting other nurses builds confidence in your skills, in your nursing skills. I think not to be afraid, to know that you're part of a team. It really is trying to get to know your leader. So if you're at a hospital that you think you're going to be at for a while or where you want to be, get to know your leader of that unit, get to know the people that take charge, do other things, try to understand the QA. I think the patient safety issue is such an important part of nursing that sometimes the bedside nursing doesn't remember or doesn't understand why we're doing some of the things we're doing. Try to understand the why. And then try not to engage in, you're always going to have someone that's very negative, that is angry, like, oh, and we can make jokes about it. And believe me, I've made jokes about it too. I have my water glass. That's going to be a horrible, horrible thing that happens on the nurse's station, but I just saved a patient life. I get it. Look, I get it. But if we understand that, some of that I do struggle with myself, but I think we have to understand what the purpose behind it and why some of that is important and why some of it's not. When you look around at the other healthcare professions, you see that the pharmacists now have to be doctorate degreed, right? They're they're at need because they have limited the amount of people that can be graduated. They have high standards to that. The respiratory therapists have different degrees of standards now, so they're very standardized. We need to standardize nursing to whatever it is. I don't care what it is, but we need to standardize and make it a profession and be proud of it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's interesting to think about too, just with like nursing is on one hand regulated and, you know, somewhat standardized, but not
Mhm.
standardized when you think about it in that perspective
Mhm.
of we have different levels of educations to be a nurse. And of course we all pass the NCLEX, but
Mhm.
how we get there can look very different. So yeah, that's an interesting thought too. And so I want to, we'll wrap up by kind of talking about where your career has gone from healthcare administration because you've recently retired and
Mhm.
you're not done with having a hand in the healthcare world yet though. So tell us a little bit about what you're doing now.
It really was not expected. I will tell you, I've been a nurse 47 years, so I've done it a long time. I love nursing. I'm an advocate of nursing. But during my chief executive officer role, I would review any medical malpractice cases that came through. And so I got to really have kind of my hand in that more than I ever did in any other role that I had. And so because of that, I had an opportunity to provide an expert opinion regarding a couple cases. And I enjoyed that because there's research involved in it. You get to look at what's really best for the patient. It doesn't matter who retained you. They're just asking for your opinion. So I enjoyed that. And then when I retired, someone reached out and said, would you like to do this on this case? And I did that. And I thought, yeah, this was fun and it made a difference. And I think I'm making a difference. I also think it's something that I wish I knew more about when I was working than I do now as I do this in my healthcare consulting thing, because I can see some of the pitfalls to avoid that I didn't ever see before. But I enjoy it very much. I provide litigation support, whatever it is. It can be about product development. It can be about a patient issue. It's a little bit of anything. And I enjoy doing it, and I do it on my own terms, and I take as many cases as I want and take as little as I want. So it is an interesting thing. I do volunteer at SCORE, which I talked about. So I mentor young people, not really all young, but small business owners. And then the Women's Healthcare Executive Network, I was president. Now I'm just vice president of membership, trying to get younger leaders to come in and really kind of have a place where we can feel safe to talk about the problems in healthcare and what we can do about it. And then I'm very active in the New Orleans Chamber. It's a great chamber, and it's a great way to meet people that are not in healthcare. And so I get to expand kind of my network of people also, and develop friendships too. It's been good.
Yeah, that's awesome. And, I think that with the like litigation support too, like
Mhm.
your experience in both the clinical role as well as the leadership and operational role must be a pretty powerful perspective to bring into that kind of work.
It does make a difference. I have seen things that I don't ever really look at it as a nurse, but you can't ever take nurse away from us, right? That's what we are. And so I'll see things and say, this doesn't look right to me or whatever. So it's been beneficial for the opinions that I had to render. So yeah. It's interesting. It's been fun and really educational. I've learned a lot because I do a lot of research too.
Yeah, that is interesting. All right. Well, Kim, I know that we've already provided a lot of really like helpful takeaways, I think, for like kind of what nurses at the bedside now can be thinking or doing with their career. But do you have any advice or kind of like maybe key skills that nurses could focus on developing if they're interested in pursuing a path into leadership?
I guess I would like all nurses to remember why we are nurses, and it's really for patient care, right? And so I think it's so important that we keep the patient first always. And it's not a slogan. It's not something that goes on your name badge. It's you really put the patient first. And when you always put the patient first, then you have to be able to be courageous enough to have a voice and stop the line if you think something is wrong. And that doesn't mean if your best friend who worked days made a mistake, you don't bring it up, you bring it up, you correct it. We have to stop the line. If the physician's ordering something that you don't want or you don't think should happen, you need to raise your concern, because we are the advocate for patients. And I think sometimes nurses forget that they're advocate, because a lot of nurses have been turned into task workers. And we're not task workers, we're the advocate for the patient. Yes, we have tasks to do that, but we're the advocate. And if we can always remember that you're that patient's advocate in the most vulnerable time, I think that nursing could soar. I just really think it can.
I think that we need that reminder as like a pop-up when we're logging into Document or, on the whiteboard in the patient room, because, days are really busy. And I think especially now more than ever in the healthcare environment, like nurses are stretched, like we have more patients, more tasks to do within that 12-hour shift. And, you know, I I can understand, and I have experienced myself how easy it is to kind of like lose sight of that. But yeah, if you can just take a breath or step back and remember
Right.
that, I think that that is very powerful. If you'd like to connect with Kim after today's show, you can find her on LinkedIn. We'll have her profile linked below in the show notes. Thanks for tuning in. Don't forget to hit subscribe to keep up with our latest episodes. And if you were inspired by today's conversation, I hope you'll share this episode with someone who'd love it just as much as you did. If you're ready to pivot your path, sign up for my free newsletter at mypivotpath.com. Get non-bedside jobs delivered to your inbox every week. And if you have questions or just want to say hi, feel free to email me at audrey@mypivotpath.com. Thanks for listening, and until next time.